Are you a businesswoman who's finding it challenging to get your ideas across and make a point? Welcome to Speakers Who Get Results with Elizabeth Bachman, a podcast dedicated to helping women get the visibility they want, whether making a speech or talking in a meeting. If you want to see how your presentation skills are doing, please go to our free 4-minute assessment at www.speakforresultsquiz.com. Elizabeth uses her 30 years of experience as an opera director to help business professionals become better presenters. This special series explores the relationship between business and art. And now, on to the show. Hello, and welcome to Speakers Who Get Results. I'm Elizabeth Bachman, your host, and this is the podcast where we interview experts about all aspects of communication, especially in the way we need to be perceived or we need to think in order to get results from what we want to say. Today, my guest is the wonderful Kathleen Kelly. She's an artist. Her official bio is that she enjoys a dynamic musical life as a pianist, opera coach, conductor, teacher, and writer. From Mozart to commissioned works by her peers, she's both deeply experienced in the classical vocal canon, and engaged in new creation. She was the first woman and the first American named as Director of Musical Studies in the Vienna State Opera. Her operatic experience is the backbone of her career, but she's also a published poet and an essayist. And what I particularly love about Kathleen is that in our interview, we talked philosophy, we talked about gender perception, we talked about history, we talked about all the various aspects of communication and how we can use it to move ahead in our lives, in our society. Here comes Kathleen Kelly. Kathy Kelly, welcome to Speakers Who Get Results. I'm so happy to have you here. Yay, hooray.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the invitation. I've really been looking forward to this.
Well, it's fun. One of the things I've been thinking about is in terms of a series on what business can learn from the arts. There are a lot of really amazing artists out there who cannot think outside the realm of the arts, whatever their particular art is. And there are a couple of people I interviewed that I'm not going to use because they couldn't get out of their own thing. And what I love about you is that besides the amazing musician you are and teacher that you are and all of that, you're a poet and you think about the world. So I really love that.
Well, thank you.
With that in mind, maybe it's relevant, maybe it's not. The question I ask all my guests is, if you were to be on stage with somebody from history, your dream interview, who would it be? What would you ask them? And who should be listening?
I love this question because I've been asked this question before in different contexts. I love it as sort of a creative juice inspiration. The answer I'm going to give today is inspired by another interview I did a couple days ago. And that interview was specifically about Richard Wagner and Tristan, because it's the anniversary of the premiere.
Tristan and Isolde, for those who are non-opera listeners, yes.
Very, very famous, game-changing opera of the 19th century. The person that I would like to interview is Clara Schumann. She was the wife of Robert Schumann, a famous composer. Later on, the very good friend, possible also romantic partner of Johannes Brahms, another famous composer of the 19th century. Brahms and the Schumanns were sort of in the conservative camp of German composers, while Richard Wagner, the composer of Tristan, and Franz Liszt, his father-in-law, were in a different camp. But and you read about this a lot in 19th century history. It's like the court of Henry VIII with all the interrelational stuff and the fame and how many hangers-on there were. But what interests me about Clara, and a part of her story that is never told, is that she was one of the most prominent pianists of her generation. She supported her family. She, for example, went on a concert tour of Russia when she was nursing. She and Schumann had 7 children together, and he was often not able to work because of different problems that he had with advancing mental illness. Although he was an important creator, he actually ended up being institutionalized, and the story of his death is very, very sad. But I wonder how much of the rivalry between those two camps was actually based in aesthetics, and how much of it was based in professional jealousy between Clara and Franz Liszt, one of the only pianists who was touring who was more famous than she was. And, you know, she occupied this sort of like conservative, you know, like fidelity to the score, you know, not too much emotional display camp. And he was like flamboyant and improvisatory and everything else. But also he composed a lot of his own work. She was also a composer, but she really tamped down that part of her career because her husband like couldn't handle the compositional rivalry in the family. So I wonder how much of her objection to Wagner and Liszt was actually based in like musical aesthetics, and how much of it was about a whole realm of expression as a composer, but also as a flamboyant performer that just wasn't available to her as a woman. So like her fame was actually based in her conservatism. It was the only road that was available to her. So I would love to talk to her and put all of those guys in the audience.
Oh, that's a great thought.
And also every single teacher I ever had who like left her out of the story.
Yes. Well, you know, the old saying goes, history is written by the winners. And what we learn is what is passed down to us, but it is also in the point of view of the people who wrote it, usually the men. And you talk about professional jealousy, and my mind as a woman who, you know, a woman in a man's business for many years as an opera director, my mind goes immediately to the men who were jealous of the women who moved up. But I also wonder how much Clara Schumann lay awake at 3 o'clock in the morning thinking, damn it, why isn't that me up there?
Right. Exactly. Maybe she didn't, you know what I mean? Maybe she didn't, but maybe she did. Or maybe all of that got channeled into like aesthetic conversations. That I would be interested to know that. But that also, that whole topic of, you know, what people say and what they don't say, what they can't say. I mean, that's so much a part of what you're talking about, you know, in your work now and in this whole series. Like how do we communicate with each other? And also what do we believe we're saying? What do we believe other people are hearing? Like that's
how that is how that is perceived. I mean, one of the things that goes throughout this podcast all the time is what someone's perception of you, how that shapes the way they listen.
Right.
And I also imagine Clara Schumann, she was a good wife. So one assumes, I mean, she did what she was supposed to do. And so she was also a product of the 19th century upbringing. Right. So if she lay awake at 3 o'clock in the morning, she being jealous, she probably also prayed to be spared of that, because that's good girls don't do that.
Right. And how much of what I imagine she would say is me laying my 21st century self back upon her. Like if I actually got
also
her,
possible,
and she look at me and say, "What are you talking about?" You know, I would just like to know. I would like to know all of it, because you know, another thing that fascinates me about the Schumanns is that they basically had like a Luddite blog. So this is something that people did. They had their Tagebuch. They kept this mutual diary But very much like Cosima Wagner's diary, it's being written for other people to read someday. Like
Uh-huh.
they're famous people who are keeping a log of their famous marriage. So I think it's a mistake to read that as though it's, you know, like the inner workings of their heart. They were reading that to they were writing that rather to leave to posterity. So I guess I also just like thinking of that. We sometimes imagine that the internet is the birth of that kind of like self-marketing, or like
Mm-hmm.
taking an intimate personal pose that is actually designed to influence what people think of us. That's
Yes.
been going on for a long time,
Yeah.
just, you know, with different technology.
You know, it's interesting. When I work with when I work with speakers, they sometimes they come to me because they need to make a result. They need to make money. Sometimes they come to me because they really need allies and they need to do that. But often the people who call me up and say, I hear you do presentation skills training, speaker training. They're the people who sit in a conference and look up at the stage and think, damn, I'm twice as smart as that person. Why isn't that me up there? How do I do that? And
How
then
do I
they come to me and I help them figure out how to do that. I can imagine Clara Schumann sitting in the audience looking up at Franz Liszt and thinking, damn, that's not the way it should be done. I could do that piece so much better.
Right. Yeah. I mean, and I think she legitimately did have those thoughts. And
Mm-hmm.
I wonder when it came to his sort of like flamboyance and adulation and all of that, was she jealous of it, or did she look at it? I mean, was the written record of what she had, of the written record that we have of what she thought, which is that she considered it to be a lower art form, like a lower way of expressing
Mm-hmm.
yourself. Was that all of it? Was that all
Hmm.
of it? I want to know more about that rivalry. I find that in so much of the writing about the Schumanns and Brahms versus Liszt and Wagner, there's really so little conversation about the pianistic profile of Clara and of Franz. Like, what did they? We know a little bit about what they thought of each other, but what each thought of the other's playing, but what did each think of the other's career? You know,
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
know, what was that? What was that like? You know,
Yeah. That's very interesting. Again, helping women advance their careers is a big part of what I do. So that's interesting. I like that idea. I also like the thought of you said something a minute ago, and I've lost it. What was it I was going to ask you? Oh yes, it just in terms of she may have looked at that and said, "Oh, tisk tisk tisk," you know, that's it's so flamboyant. That's nothing. But the thing is that the romantic movement in music and words and writing came as a reaction to the rationalist movement of the 18th century. So the 18th century writers who were being very rationalist, and then the romantics were the generation rebelled against their parents.
Mhm.
So they said, we're not going to be all about intellect and fact. We're going to be about feeling and nature and all this wonderful emotional stuff. And one of the things that allows me to sleep at night is when I look at what's happening in our current world and I look back at patterns. I've been doing this for as long as I can remember, about historical patterns and waves and how they come, and you know where we are in the 21st century, how that came out of what happened before. It's happening a little faster now because communication tools are faster, but it's a pattern that human beings have been going through forever and ever. And we think of history as a spiral where you're going, hopefully you're going up, and then every once in a while you have to take a step back, or there's a war that changes everything and kills off a lot of people and you have to build up again, or there's an economic crash that brings everyone back and then you have to build up again. Hopefully it's 2 steps forward for every 1 step back. But I often think of history as a spiral, And so if you look at the Romantics, by the time they got to fame, they got there because their audience was ready to listen. And they were playing to people who wanted something more emotional and coming out of wars and revolutions and rational thinkings, all very much part of their history. How did you get through the French Revolution and the mess that the rest of Europe made? And for that matter, what we know of as history comes from the European writings. So we only know what people chose to write.
Right. Right. And we know whose modes of expression got backed, right?
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, but that's history, right? We learn part of the story. And that's a big part of communication too. What we come to believe is the story, the ways in which we forget that what we know is part of the story, and that, it's very tempting to talk from a place of expertise or like knowledge that you've fallen in love with, or that is meaningful to you. It's good to always remind yourself that part of something. What you don't know is always going to be so much bigger than what you know.
Yeah.
Always, always, always. And to stay curious and in the mind of a beginner about that. I think that's hard. I think that's aspirational, but like absolutely like of mortal importance.
This is wonderful. This is really fun, because then when you take it to how you communicate nowadays, that anytime you are trying to convince someone of something, this is the same thing that singers do. You and I you're still working with singers. I did it for 30 years and moved to speakers, but the skills you need to sell a song are not that different from the skills you need to sell a product or a service, or within a company to sell an idea. So let me ask you, when you're working with someone, let's just talk about language first.
Sure.
And words. You're a poet. I wasn't going to ask this, but it occurs to me. What's your definition of poetry? What makes poetry different from
I think we're having
regular speech?
I lost you there for a minute. You froze on me, so.
Okay, hold on a second. So editors, we're going to pause for a minute. Kathy, if I disappear, sometimes I will start that question over again. Okay, but if I disappear, just hang on. Every once in a while, my computer decides to turn itself off. Okay. And then I have to reboot, and it comes back again. Gotcha. So editors, give us a minute. We'll also let the fire engine go by. And we'll let that happen.
Oh, life in the city.
Yes. Okay, we'll try that again.
Okay, perfect.
So Kathy, I want to talk to you about language. And before we even get into how do we shape a phrase, you are a poet and a musician. What sort of connections and differences do you see between spoken language and musical language?
I mean, I think that musical language largely arises out of spoken language. There's music, particularly rhythmic music, but also music of pitch, of phrase, that is part and parcel of any spoken language. And that makes it into the musical forms that arise out of our souls, out of our creativity. There's a place to start. I could blather on, but perhaps it's wise to direct the stream.
Okay. Well, a friend of mine once said poetry is words that mean more in that form than they do if they're just prose.
Yeah, it's something that I like to say in a master class is to start with the first line of the famous Song of Ariel from The Tempest of Shakespeare. Full fathom 5 thy father lies. He could have said your dad drowned in 30 feet of water.
Uh-huh. Exactly.
But to choose those words that are full of so much alliteration and assonance, full fathom 5, all those ah vowels and all those f's. The point of the beginning of that phrase is not the factual information. There's something bigger. There's a world that's being created through those words. And the same thing with music. Every cool thing I say, I steal from somebody else, by the way. So I know I stole that Shakespeare thing from someone, and it was such a long time ago that I don't remember. So credited to whoever that was. But also on the old television series that Leonard Bernstein did with the New York Philharmonic.
Yes.
One of those episodes was about opera. And he focused on the third act of La Bohème, which is very popular. If your listeners don't know that opera, they certainly know Rent, which is the same story. But in the third act he took the aria of the character Mimi from the third act, and he had an actress read the text, which takes about 30 seconds. And then he had a singer sing the aria, which takes about 3 minutes. And I remember he said, maybe I'm paraphrasing, but he basically said those extra 2.5 minutes are everything she isn't saying. So I do think that is, thank you for pointing out that that's part of the intersection, but I don't think that poetry and music are different than human communication in this way. We're always only saying a part of what's in here. And I think that's fascinating to explore as a musician, when you've got, musical text and text, language on the page. When are you saying exactly what those words mean? And when are you saying something that is bigger than that? Or when are you saying words that are literally the opposite of what you intend? As humans, we do that every time we open our mouths.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, and what it makes me think about is when you're writing marketing copy. So I know it's probably a sacrilege to compare poetry and marketing copy, but both—
it's all communication, right?
It's all communication, and both, we'll call them art forms. Both art forms are about having the words evoke a feeling in your listener.
Yeah.
And so the marketing copy that you write for an American is different from the marketing copy you'll write for a German or a Japanese or somebody who's reading English as maybe their third language. So so I go back to Clara Schumann, actually, and her crowd, they were writing for a 19th century audience with metaphor that invoked the natural world, because that's what the Romantic movement was all about.
Right. We're stressed out living in cities, and the Industrial Revolution is kind of killing us. So we all need to go into the woods and figure it out.
Yes, which actually takes me back to my Shakespeare teacher in college when I took a class in Shakespeare, and he said, yes, Shakespeare, you've got the classic go out into the green world and magic happens. If you look at the Midsummer Night's Dream, you have the normal Athens in Midsummer Night's Dream, and Theseus and Hippolyta, and they're getting married, and then they all go out into the woods, and suddenly magic happens, and bottom gets turned into an ass's head, and Titania falls in love, and the lovers who were mismatched are mismatched again and find each other again. And then they come back to the city out of the green world,
right,
and take up their lives, but the green world has transformed them. So sorry, Clara and Franz and Johannes and all of that. You didn't invent that, actually. Shakespeare was talking about that, and who knows where Shakespeare learned it. So probably from the Druids and the Picts and the Druidic legends.
Well, I mean, holding up Greece as a symbol of like rationalism and philosophy, thinking that philosophy kind of comes out of Greek culture. At least that's what we say in the Western world. So yeah, I love what you say about Midsummer being this sort of parable of, here we are with our rational brains deciding what we should do, but then we have to like go outside of rationality. We have to, and so like the natural world, there are like mosquitoes and bears and
yes,
magical plants, and then we learn something, then we can go back into society. But like that's the classic conflict, right? The world around you and its structures, as opposed to what's in here.
Which is a fundamental reason why going to a concert takes you out of your everyday life. The whole point of going to a concert is to be taken away and let your mind drift and let the music tell you something. And in opera, especially the catharsis, the emotional catharsis of weeping as Madame Butterfly kills herself. She says goodbye to her baby and kills herself, gives us permission to feel those things that we don't necessarily get to feel.
That is part of what can happen in opera. Yeah, I think there's other things that we're maybe taking a harder look at, right? I mean, I have experienced the butterfly emotional catharsis, but I also have, I certainly am at a point personally, and I think maybe, based on what I'm seeing in our industry, I might not be alone. To be in a place where I also can't get away from the fact that the great stories of the 19th century that made it onto the operatic stage are stories that come from a very particular viewpoint and out of a very particular set of circumstances.
Now that was the point I was just going to make, and here you already have it. Okay,
sorry.
No, that's okay. Go right ahead. Madame Butterfly was written as a potboiler by a 19th century man with a certain idea of what women's self-sacrifice was about.
Well, and guess what? At the end of that story, she doesn't die. At the end of
That's right.
The John Luther Long story, she takes her baby and Suzuki, and they piss off. The Pinkertons never get their hands on that child.
That's right.
It was changed when David Belasco developed the play for Sarah Bernhardt, the great actress, and she wanted a death scene, and that's why they changed it.
That's right.
That's what Puccini saw when he came to New York. And
he saw the Belasco version, not the original John Luther Long version.
Right. So, I mean, like there are big issues in all of it, in the story and in the adaptation and in the opera. So like there's an interesting and thorny place, right? On the one hand, theater, opera, but also theater, that was a place where women could be famous and could like make money and have influence. Sarah Bernhardt being the kind of actress who could say, this is what I want in my play, create that for me. That was an avenue not available to very many women, but there were not very many avenues available to women professionally. Still at that point, in general, once they married, they had to leave the stage. So on the one hand, the women's stories that you see in opera and the singers who became famous or the actresses who became famous, that was a rare and interesting avenue for creative women. On the other hand, the effect of the music on those stories, I'm not sure has been an important part of the conversation at all in actually moving women's lives forward. You know, when I see people like crying at Butterfly or crying when Tosca throws herself off, like, has that actually been a meaningful part of the conversation in like dealing with human trafficking in the world, in dealing with, the sexual assault of women in professional situations? Of our top 10 operas, I would have to go back and look at what the list of them are, but 3 of them involve as a major plot point men forcing women to have sex with them in order to like save someone else's life or to get what they want. 2 of them in Traviata and Butterfly involve women like literally selling themselves to men for money. I mean, like, but I don't think that opera goers connect with that or the continuation of those problems in the world. I don't think people see Traviata and think, I want to do something about sex trafficking. I want to pay attention to that. So what do we do with all that stuff? That's probably like way too loaded. But to circle back to the topic of how we communicate, it's tricky, right? Because there's music there to fall in love with. There are performers to admire. There's a lot that hits you in the heart. But I think that the things that you understand and the things that you love can help keep you away from the things that you don't understand and the things that are harder to love. And that's sort of true in every conversation. Yes. Again, we connect with what we know. And it's important to just keep on remembering that there's as intense as that is, there's more than that you don't know, and that you have to stay open and curious about. And that may not hit you in a way that feels so good.
Yeah. Well, it's certainly, these are the conversations that we should have when we get together to produce something like that or to tell a story like that. And then on the other hand, you need to use communication and you need to use words, and the melody of the message is one of the things I say all the time to move forward and get on with your life. So to a certain, yes, you need to pick your battles. And yes, there are things to discuss, hopefully to make us aware, to make us aware of, I am a product of my culture as much as anyone else. And so I know there are things that I notice that others don't. And there are things that others notice that I don't. And the key is to stay curious.
Yep, absolutely.
Now, the title of this podcast is Speakers Who Get Results. So let's talk a little bit about some of the practicalities of it in terms of shaping a phrase. You always have singers who make the singers say the text of what they're going to sing. How do you work with singers who have to deliver dialogue? And they come at it from the point of view of a musician, where it's really about making those beautiful sounds. How do you treat text when it is text alone?
It's not something that I do generally a lot of work with, actually, except in the realm of recitative. I actually think it's useful to take any text, including text that's going to be beautifully sung, and deal with it on its own merits. So, for example, if you're working on an opera with a lot of recitative that should go by at the pacing of speech. So, for example, The Marriage of Figaro, all of the notes in that show are sung, but the pacing of the parts that are done just with the harpsichord should mirror the pacing of speech. So one of the things that I like to work on with singers is to come in touch with how varied the tempo of our speech is. Again, just as communicating humans, we vary the tempo of our speech all the time. For example, if I want to make a point to you, I'll give you some information, I'll give you some more information. That tends to go at a fairly, rapid and fairly consistent tempo. And then when I want to make my conclusion, I slow down.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes I tend to drop pitch. Some people tend to raise pitch when they make the conclusion.
Mm-hmm.
They're like fact A, fact B, fact C, and then, or fact A, fact B, fact C, and then.
That's all the melody. Yes, absolutely.
Right? It depends. Different people have different melodies that they like. Sometimes people amp up the volume when they want to land a point. Sometimes they bring the volume back when they want to land a point.
Mm-hmm.
And it's interesting to explore with an individual person. If you are angry, do you tend to turn it up to 11 or do you tend to turn it down to like 2? Like what's the pace of that? The interesting thing about that is that I have to reconfigure this. So applying that to more lyrical music, an aria that's got longer notes in it, more beautiful high notes. You're not in charge of the timing there. The composer has composed your timing for you. But even in that, you can explore the language to see where you can lengthen a consonant, where you can slowly do a diphthong, or where maybe in the language where you're singing, you don't slowly do a diphthong, you do it like cleanly at the end. To take apart different values like this, I always think of this extraordinary performance by Frank Sinatra. You can see it on YouTube. It's a live concert in London, and he's singing One for the Road. And in one of the very first lines, his character says to the bartender, "So set 'em up, Joe. I got a little story you ought to know." And Sinatra does this little thing. He just elongates all of the S's. He says, "So set 'em up, Joe." And just those long S's, it's completely technical. He was such a micromanager of a singer. You can go through and write down everything he did.
Yeah.
But these long S's, they convey maybe somebody who's had like a couple whiskeys too many at closing time. They also convey like reluctance to actually talk. What you find out in the course of that song is that the man who wants to talk about his breakup is actually not going to say anything about his breakup.
Yes.
He just doesn't want to be by himself. That's it. And he puts you in a place to hear that just by saying, "So set him up, Joe." It's the difference between full fathom 5 and 30 feet of water, right? So all of that is part of a musical discussion. I think it would be part of a purely textual discussion as well. The trick in that is that when you start connecting to your own expressive hardwiring, it doesn't work in every language. And I think that goes back to a couple of things that you have both said and alluded to. The expressive hardwiring of my language, which happens to be English, which involves quite hard accents, real de-emphasis and actually depronunciation of unaccented syllables, and the ability to lengthen any consonant I want for any reason without disturbing the comprehensibility of my language. I can say full fathom 5, I can say full fathom 5. You get different ideas from that, but you don't start saying, what are those words? You can always understand me. I can't transfer that to Italian. I can't transfer that to French. Those languages work in a different way. Those parameters are set differently. And I think that as a metaphor for how we talk to each other is really interesting. The more committed you get, the more your natural heart, what's naturally inside of you that you don't even know about will come to the fore. And the less successful that can be in transfer to somebody else's native language.
So there's another point that I wanted to ask you about. Oh, good. You've just handed me this great, just handed me a transitional line there. We are living in an increasingly international business world. And especially if you're in a city, you'll have people around you. Luckily for me, English is my native language and English is the international language of business. So I am working all the time with people who have wonderful things to say, for whom English is their second or third language, or the listeners may have English as their second or third language. So I use a lot of the diction training that I was taught when working with singers in terms of how do you pronounce things well.
Right.
Opera singers, most of the time, are singing, unless they're Italian, they're not singing their native language. If there's, you have to be able to sing in 4 or 5 languages. You also have to be able to work in 4 or 5 languages. You know, one of the I never got around to learning Russian, except a couple of key phrases. But most of our colleagues work very comfortably in, you know, if in the working environment in an opera company, you're either working in English or Italian or German, unless most of the cast is Russian. But you get together on day one and you say, what's our common language going to be? And you muddle through.
Right.
Getting back to speaking, well, actually, let's just say basic communicating. You were the first American to run the study program at the Vienna State Opera.
Specifically to be the Studienleiterin, so kind of.
So explain what Studienleiterin means.
At a German opera house where there's an ensemble of singers, so a group of singers who are cast consistently throughout the season.
Basically, they have weekly. They're there all season, and you.
Yeah, that's a good basic way to understand it. So they've got many assignments in a season like Vienna's, where there are 52 operas that are produced every year. People have 17 or 20 things, more commonly 13 to 17. But after they've got roles in their repertoire, they can be potentially responsible for up to 24 things in a season. So you have a group of singers who have to stay up on all that repertoire, and a group of pianists. The Studienleiter or Studienleiterin is the person who organizes the daily working of that schedule. So that is what I did for a short period of time.
And talk about the differences between working in, so it was a very international group, but working in the Austrian system as opposed to working in the US system. It's sort of like Austrian, I think framework is what I'm thinking about. There's like the Austrian thought process and framework versus the American thought process and framework, bearing in mind that the whole time that you're still working with people from all over the world.
Right. I think my biggest takeaway I'm so grateful for that opportunity in the middle of my life, because it just kind of fell out of the sky, really. Mm-hmm. And what it gave me the opportunity to experience that I would not have experienced in another way was to go over as a very, like a mid-career person, somebody at a high level of experience, to another system, and to realize how much of communication and understanding is predicated on the entire community that you're part of. One imagines that, especially when one is like in the fishbowl that one is born in, right? I'm going to stop using the one construction. I don't actually like it. But you're in your own culture, you get trained in your own culture, you meet the colleagues of your own culture, you work in the places in your own culture. And I've been as a guest in a lot of different locations. So all of that travel can also kind of help you believe that you're really good at adapting. It was really hard for me to adapt. I mean, and in 3 years, in the scope of the 3 years where I was there, I didn't do it completely or successfully. But but to try to become part of a different system where everyone had like trained in that culture and had their relationships in that culture and like worked in the systems in that culture. We all knew the job that we were supposed to do. We were all able to communicate with each other on a daily basis. But in terms of being heard, in terms of being able to make myself heard, in terms of all of that second level communication, you know, words are easy to understand. Communication and really that's a constant act of like will and agreement between people. It can be between two people, it can be between an entire system. What I walk away with from that is how easy it is as we get older, as some of the flexibility of our expertise increases, but the flexibility of our processing system tends to slow down a little bit, which also exacerbates this problem. But we get very used to where we are, you know, and how we work. It's exactly at this moment that we should find different ways to listen and different ways to work harder. You know, because we can become part of a large system that believes that it hears and sees, but is not hearing and seeing in some very important ways.
You know, it's the phrase assumptions keeps coming up, you know, and cultural assumptions,
right.
The things we take for granted. That is actually one of the joys of working internationally, is realizing the things that we take for granted, which aren't necessarily what our listeners are taking for granted.
Right.
And that goes within American cultural assumptions and gender cultural assumptions.
Yes.
You know, what do women assume is true, which is not the same as what men assume is true. And it's not necessarily one is better than the other. It's just keeping that in mind when you're trying to communicate.
Right.
You know, I think this is, what can you say looking ahead as our world gets more international, and we're questioning a lot of cultural assumptions now. Do you have any thoughts about what to bear in mind as we move forward from here? And I should just say that we are recording this. This is going to be available on the internet for as long as the website's up. So maybe
as long as the internet survives.
Yes, right. So somebody might be listening to this a couple of years from now, but we are recording this in the middle of the COVID-19 pandemic, where we are in the middle of a giant shift in assumptions and expectations, and a global recession that we're just at the beginning of. And we really, truly don't know what's coming next.
And hopefully at the beginning of major, major social upheaval in the United States. I mean, hopefully it is just the beginning, and it is something that will continue for a while. So the availability of the chances to really shake up the way that we speak and the way that we listen, like it feels like a major moment that could be seized. You know, all of these things weirdly work together in this way. To take the COVID part, it's been interesting to work as a musician, as a teacher, but also as a collaborator on performance over the last couple of months, in situations where I can't be in the same room with any of my students or any of my recital partners. And yet there are good things about it. We don't necessarily like them. We're not necessarily comfortable with them. And yet here's the interesting thing. When two people come together in a room, there's that explosion of like vibe between the two of them. And if you're talking about music instruction, you're often talking about a very energetic teacher and a very energetic student. There's a lot of personality in the room. So there's a lot of nonverbal communication that is very important. And it's important on every level. It's not just important in terms of inspiration, although that's part of it. If somebody does something beautiful, you can be like, wow. But some of the physical cues that we give each other, I mean, this from working in theater at a very high level. Some of the physical cues that we give one another are to cement memory. So, we're helping each other technically all the time with nonverbal cues.
Mm-hmm.
To have the nonverbal communication kind of flattened out over the screen like this,
yes,
and to have to rely more on what we're actually analyzing and saying about what we hear. If somebody sends me a recording of an aria, I have time to listen to it. Also, a lot of our analysis is taking place asynchronously, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the way in which
you said asynchronously.
Asynchronously. So when in teaching online, there's some of it that happens in real time in a connection like this interview, but there's some of it that happens through exchange of sound files.
Mm-hmm.
Just because sound quality is better, that's all there is to it. So I get a lot of information from my students by having them record for me and send it to me. So interestingly,
I do too. Yes, exactly.
More of our communication, more of our feedback now is generated asynchronously. So I've started to see that the way in which I say things when I'm not saying it to someone in the moment, and the way in which they hear them, when like the heat of wanting to please each other, wanting to get it right, wanting to say the thing that will be transformative, wanting to perform the action that will show that the transformation has taken place, take all of that out. In some ways, our communication with each other is clearer. Yeah. In some ways, the personal responsibility that I have seen my students take on is greater because it has to be. Like the whole, and that's it. So that gets to who writes the history.
Uh-huh.
Because in teaching an art form, in passing on, generations behind us, Clara Schumann, actually, my lineage goes back to Franz Liszt. I studied with someone who studied with someone who studied with Franz Liszt. So
wow. Okay.
One of the many great-great-grandchildren, too many. But
physical grandchildren or spiritual grandchildren?
I mean, definitely not physical. But our tradition is to pass that on. It's like an oral tradition, right? We get in room one-on-one, and the person who's received all of that through education and through experience continues to pass it on. It's very interesting to see that sort of like mentor and student, or like expert and acolyte relationship upended a little bit, or at least flattened, to have that part of it, like, you're an expert and I want to know what you know. I loved being a student, I want to pass it on. To have some of that just like out of the equation, is clarifying in some ways that I think is really exciting for the day that we go back to face-to-face communication and bring some of these clarified and amped up skills into the room with us. I mean, I think that could be really important and transformative in a way that is needed and bleeds out into other topics, other ways in which the preservation of something we care about has come with a hierarchy that is problematic and also has like real elements of injustice.
Mm-hmm.
And that goes out into, inequities in the world that continue to persist, not because people don't see them, but because there's an advantage to them.
Yes.
If all of those advantages are called into question at the same time, we have a real opportunity. And, I hope we seize it. I love that it seems to be that there is an actual shift in emphasis in terms of like who gets to talk and who feels like they should listen.
Yes.
And like, if we can stick with that, it could be like, I hope we do.
Yeah.
I hope we do.
Well, nothing in society has really changed without people marching in the streets. Mm-hmm. And that's part of the spiral as we go. So let's hope that this is indeed 2 steps forward. And we as artists can illuminate that and discuss that and talk about that through our form of expression, which are the arts.
Yep.
Well, Kathleen Kelly, I could talk to you for the next 2 hours. It would be great fun. I may have to come back to you in about 6 months and revisit this conversation, because I had a whole list over here of things I was going to ask you that we didn't get to. But thank you so much for being part of this.
Thank you for the invitation. It was wonderful. I enjoyed talking to you so much.
Okay. Well, this has been wonderful. This is my wonderful friend, of whom I honor and admire and just love to pieces, Kathleen Kelly. This has been Speakers Who Get Results. And if you like this, please go like us on YouTube, like us on Facebook and LinkedIn, leave us a review on iTunes, please, and tell your friends. If you enjoyed it, share this. There will be more of it. This has been Elizabeth Bachman, your host, and this is Speakers Who Get Results.
We have just concluded another great episode of Speakers Who Get Results with your host, Elizabeth Bachman. If you got value from today's episode, please feel free to share us with your friends and colleagues. You may also visit elizabethbachman.com for additional resources. Be sure to tune in every week for new episodes, and thanks for tuning in.